Lieutenant James Carter was a highly trained Navy SEAL, known for his calmness under pressure and his sharp instincts. On this particular mission, he found himself preparing for one of the toughest rescues of his career. The location was a remote, snow-covered mountain region, far from the nearest town or help. The winds howled through the peaks, carrying with them a bitter cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Every step through the deep snow was exhausting, but James didn't hesitate. He knew that a law enforcement officer and her K-9 partner had gone missing in these mountains, and their lives were hanging by a thread. Time was critical, and in such freezing conditions, even a few hours could mean the difference between life and death. As he loaded his gear into his snow-ready all-terrain vehicle, James checked everything meticulously. His rifle was clean and ready, his survival kit packed with essentials, and his communication devices were set to maintain contact with the base. He also carried special treats and gear for the K-9, knowing that animals could sense danger and fear in humans, and earning their trust quickly could be vital. His mind was focused, running through every possible scenario he might face. Avalanches, hidden crevasses, extreme cold, or even the presence of hostile individuals who could have captured the officer. Navy SEAL training had prepared him for all kinds of threats, but the unpredictability of nature in this region made the mission especially dangerous. As he drove up the winding mountain path, the snow started falling heavily, turning the world around him into a white blur. Visibility was almost zero, and the howling wind made it difficult to hear anything beyond the roar of the storm. Yet James moved steadily, keeping a keen eye on the trail. Every few minutes, he slowed down to inspect the tracks in the snow. Some were human footprints, partially covered by the fresh snow, while others were paw prints, leading him to believe that he was indeed following the missing officer and her K-9 partner. He noted that some footprints looked hurried, as if the officer had tried to run or escape from something. This detail sent a chill down his spine, not just from the cold, but from the realization that whoever or whatever had caused the situation could still be nearby. While driving and scanning the area, James also thought about the officer herself. He knew she was experienced and well-trained, but even the best-trained individuals could struggle in these extreme conditions. And the K-9, Rex, as he had heard from the report, was no ordinary dog. German shepherds were intelligent, fiercely loyal, and protective. But even Rex would be challenged by the snow, the cold, and the unknown dangers lurking in the mountains. James understood that saving them wouldn't just require skill and strategy, but also patience and understanding. The dog's reaction could make or break the mission. If Rex was scared or mistrusting, it could complicate everything. As he reached a higher altitude, the wind became more violent, and the snow harder to navigate. Trees, heavy with snow, leaned dangerously, and the ground beneath could be slippery and unpredictable. Yet James pressed on, confident in his abilities but aware of the risks. His training told him to expect the unexpected, and he kept alert for anything unusual: broken branches, disturbed snow, or sounds that didn't match the natural rhythm of the mountains. Every instinct told him that he was close to finding the officer and her K-9. During a brief stop, James checked his equipment again. His hands were numb from the cold, but he ignored the discomfort. He knew that if he hesitated for too long, the officer and Rex could be suffering even more. He sipped some water and adjusted his backpack, making sure everything was secure for the climb ahead. Then, with a deep breath, he set off again, moving carefully but quickly through the thick snow. His focus was total. There was no room for distraction. Each step was deliberate, each movement precise, and each decision had to be the right one. He had trained for years for situations like this, but the pressure of knowing someone's life depended on him added an intensity that only a real mission could bring. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows on the snow, James knew that nightfall would make the rescue even more dangerous. But he refused to slow down. He visualized the officer tied up, waiting, and Rex growling, protective and confused. The thought of them struggling in the snow pushed him forward, faster and more determined. He could feel the adrenaline sharpening his senses, making every sound louder, every movement clearer. Even though the storm was raging, James's mind was calm and focused. He knew that in situations like this, panic could cost lives, and calm, precise action could save them. By the time he reached a small ridge overlooking a frozen valley, James paused for a moment. He could see faint traces in the snow, leading into a small clearing hidden by trees. His heart rate increased, not out of fear, but in anticipation. This was the point where preparation, skill, and instinct would all come together. He silently vowed that he would not leave without the officer and Rex safe. With careful, measured movements, he began descending toward the clearing, ready for whatever awaited him in the snow-covered silence. As James carefully made his way down the ridge, the snow grew deeper and heavier. Each step felt like wading through thick, icy cotton, and the wind whipped sharply against his face, biting at his exposed skin. His eyes scanned every inch of the terrain, searching for signs of the missing officer and her K-9 partner. Snow-covered branches creaked and groaned, threatening to snap under their own weight, and hidden rocks and uneven ground made every step risky. Despite the cold, James moved silently, relying on his training to conserve energy while staying alert to any hint of danger. Soon, he noticed something unusual. The snow near a small grove of trees was disturbed. Broken twigs and scattered footprints suggested a struggle. The tracks were partially covered by new snowfall, but they were unmistakable. A person had been dragged or pulled through this area, and the paw prints beside them indicated that a dog had been trying to follow, protect, or even fight off the threat. James crouched low to study the tracks more carefully, noting the spacing and direction. The human footprints were uneven, suggesting the officer had been in pain or forced to move against her will. The paw prints were frantic, almost chaotic, revealing the dog's panic and determination to stay close. James's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from focus. He understood the signs immediately. Someone had attacked or captured the officer and her K-9, and they were likely still nearby, possibly hidden or waiting. He had to proceed carefully. One wrong move could alert the perpetrators if they were still around, or it could trigger a reaction from the protective dog, which might mistake him for a threat. He adjusted his stance, moving low to the ground to keep his profile minimal while scanning for any movement or sound that didn't belong in the wilderness. The air was filled with the sharp scent of pine and the faint metallic tang of blood, carried on the cold wind. James inhaled carefully, letting his trained senses process every detail. The officer and her dog had been through a traumatic event, and both were likely exhausted, frightened, and in pain. His mind raced through scenarios. Was the threat gone, leaving them alone and injured, or were there still hostile individuals nearby, watching from a hidden spot? His SEAL instincts told him to expect the worst but act with precision, not panic. Every decision now would determine whether he could rescue them safely. As he moved closer to the grove, James's experience in search and rescue missions came into play. He noted the faint indentation of footprints leading toward a small depression in the snow, a natural hollow that could have been used as a hiding place or a temporary holding spot. The tracks slowed as they entered the hollow, indicating the officer had likely stopped struggling, either too exhausted to continue or restrained by her captors. The paw prints, however, became more erratic, circling the area repeatedly. Rex, the K-9, had been trying to protect her and was clearly distressed by the lack of movement from the officer. James understood the dog's behavior immediately. It was acting instinctively, guarding its human and reacting to the tension in the environment. Despite the blinding snow and harsh wind, James carefully followed the tracks. Every crunch of snow under his boots seemed amplified in the cold, silent landscape. He used hand signals to communicate with himself more than anyone else, reminding himself to stay quiet and composed. His breathing was steady, and he kept his rifle close but relaxed, ready to act at a moment's notice. This part of the mission was delicate. A single wrong move could endanger both the officer and her dog, so he had to balance speed with caution, moving just fast enough to reach them before the storm worsened, but slow enough to avoid mistakes. The storm grew stronger, whipping up snow in blinding gusts that reduced visibility to just a few feet. James relied on his memory of the terrain, the footprints, and the occasional sound, like a snapping branch or the faint shuffle of movement in the distance, to navigate. Each detail mattered. He remembered training exercises in similar conditions where even minor misjudgments could lead to disaster. Now, every lesson, every drill, every simulation mattered more than ever. As he approached a line of trees where the tracks disappeared into denser cover, James paused. He crouched behind a snow-laden bush and scanned the area. The officer was nowhere in sight, but he could see subtle signs that something had happened here. A flattened patch of snow, marks on tree bark, and small indentations suggesting someone had been tied or restrained. He also noticed the paw prints circling the area repeatedly. Rex was nearby, either waiting or trying to locate his human. James knew the dog could be dangerous if startled or threatened, so he kept his movements slow and deliberate, speaking softly to himself to maintain calm. Time seemed to stretch as he moved cautiously through the grove. The snowstorm made everything eerie and isolated, but James pushed fear aside. He focused on the mission, on the officer and her K9, and on the fact that every second counted in the freezing conditions. The footprints led him further into the dense forest, where visibility was almost zero. Branches scraped against his face, snow clung to his uniform, and the cold seeped into his bones, but James did not waver. His training told him that hesitation could cost lives. Finally, after what felt like hours in the blinding snow, James reached the edge of a small clearing. The disturbed snow, footprints, and paw prints suggested the officer and Rex were nearby. He crouched low, analyzing the area from behind a tree, preparing for the moment he would finally see them. The tension was high, but James's mind was clear. He knew the next steps had to be precise, patient, and controlled. Every movement, every decision from here on would determine the success of the rescue and the safety of both the officer and her loyal K9 companion. After carefully following the tracks through the dense, snow-covered forest, James Carter finally reached a small, hidden clearing. The snowfall was still heavy, whipping around him in icy gusts, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He slowed down, instinctively lowering his body and moving silently. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for whatever he might find. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from focus and anticipation. He knew the missing officer and her K9 were close, and the next few moments could determine whether he succeeded in this critical rescue. As James pushed through a thick curtain of snow-laden branches, he saw a figure slumped against a tree in the center of the clearing. His eyes narrowed, and he quickly assessed the situation from a safe distance. The officer was tied to the tree, her uniform torn in several places, and her body shivering violently in the bitter cold. She looked exhausted, her face pale and streaked with frost from the snowstorm. It was clear that she had been struggling to free herself for hours, but the bindings were too tight, and her strength was fading fast. James felt a surge of urgency. He had to reach her before hypothermia or injury made it impossible to save her. Next to the officer, he saw Rex, the German Shepherd K9, standing protectively. The dog's fur was dusted with snow, his ears perked, and his body tense. He growled low in his throat, eyes fixed on James. The dog was clearly confused and suspicious, unsure if this new person was a threat or a savior. James understood immediately that gaining the dog's trust was as important as freeing the officer herself. One wrong move could provoke Rex, putting both the officer and himself at risk. James had trained for countless rescue scenarios, including situations with highly protective animals, but this felt uniquely intense. He moved slowly, calculating every step. Speaking in a calm, low voice, he began to reassure the dog. "Easy, boy. I'm here to help," he whispered, his tone steady and confident. His hands were empty, showing Rex he carried no immediate threat. The dog's growl softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. James took another small step closer, mindful not to make sudden movements. His focus was absolute. He had to read every subtle signal from the dog to avoid alarming it. While he was doing this, James also kept his eyes on the officer. She noticed him approaching and tried to speak, but the wind and snow carried her voice away. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't reach him clearly, but her eyes communicated fear, relief, and desperation all at once. James understood immediately that she had been trapped here for hours, alone in the cold, and that Rex had been her sole protector. The sight of the dog acting so fiercely but remaining loyal was a reminder of how strong their bond was. He knew that rescuing her meant not only untying her but also earning Rex's trust in the process. James reached into his pack slowly and pulled out a small treat he had brought for Rex. He extended his hand carefully, letting the dog see and smell it. Rex sniffed cautiously, keeping his body tense but curious. James spoke softly the entire time, keeping his tone steady and non-threatening. The dog's ears twitched, and after a tense moment, he allowed James to come slightly closer. It was a breakthrough, the first sign that Rex was beginning to accept him. Now confident that Rex was less likely to attack, James moved toward the officer. He crouched low, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might alarm the dog. He examined the bindings quickly but thoroughly, noting how they were tied and where the knots were. Using the training he had practiced countless times, he worked swiftly to untie the ropes. The officer's shivering hands struggled at first, but James encouraged her gently, keeping his movements steady and calm. "You're okay. Almost free," he reassured her. Slowly, the tight ropes fell away, and she rubbed her wrists, grateful for the relief and warmth returning to her body. Once the officer was free, she immediately reached down to Rex. "Good boy, you stayed strong," she whispered, hugging the dog tightly. The dog responded with gentle nudges, tail wagging slightly despite the snow covering him. James watched quietly, knowing that this bond between the officer and her K9 was extraordinary. He had seen loyalty and courage before, but the connection between them was palpable, almost tangible, in the cold, quiet clearing. With the officer now untied and Rex calmed but still alert, James took a moment to assess the situation. He noted the surrounding terrain, the snow depth, and the safest route back toward their extraction point. He knew the journey back would be just as dangerous as the rescue itself. The snowstorm showed no signs of letting up, and the freezing temperatures would sap their energy quickly. But for now, James allowed a brief moment of relief. They were together, alive, and aware. The officer had survived, and Rex had fulfilled his role as protector. The moment highlighted the bravery and determination of both human and dog, and James felt a quiet respect for them both. With careful movements, James positioned himself slightly ahead, ready to lead them safely out of the clearing. The officer and Rex followed, each step cautious but coordinated. The clearing was behind them, but the danger was still present. James knew the storm was relentless, the terrain treacherous, and the hours ahead demanding. Yet the first hurdle was overcome, the officer was free, and the K9 had accepted him as a trusted ally. It was a small victory in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving winter landscape, but a crucial one that set the stage for their journey to safety. After freeing the officer from the tight ropes, James Carter thought the hardest part of the mission might be over. But as he turned his attention fully to Rex, the K9, he realized that the dog's protective instincts could be just as dangerous as any environmental threat. Rex was pacing in small circles around the officer, growling low in his throat, his sharp eyes fixed on James. Every time James made a slight movement, the dog stiffened, ears forward, tail tense. It was clear that Rex saw him as a potential threat, not as an ally. The German Shepherd had been through hours of stress, watching its human partner struggle and fight to survive. Now, in the middle of a snow-covered clearing, Rex's instincts told him to guard and defend, and James had to respect that. James knew that the key to a successful rescue wasn't just freeing the officer. It was ensuring Rex trusted him. The dog's behavior could be unpredictable. One sudden movement, one wrong tone of voice, and Rex might attack, thinking he was protecting his human from a stranger. James slowly assessed the dog's body language. The growl was low but steady, his posture stiff, and his eyes focused and unblinking. These were signs of a dog ready to defend, but not necessarily to attack immediately. James drew on his extensive training in working with K9 units. He knew patience, calmness, and confidence were the only ways to ease Rex's tension. He moved a few steps back to give the dog space, speaking in a quiet, even tone. "Easy, boy. I'm here to help, not hurt," he murmured. His words were slow and deliberate, meant more to soothe than to command. James lowered his body slightly, crouching so he was not towering over Rex. The dog responded instantly, tilting his head slightly but still cautious. This was progress, but James understood it was only the first step. He had to build trust gradually, respecting the dog's protective nature while making it clear that he meant no harm. From his pack, James slowly pulled out a small treat he had brought for Rex. He extended it cautiously, letting the dog see it from a safe distance. The snow swirled around them, and the cold made the air seem even sharper, but James's focus was undeterred. Rex sniffed the air, twitching his ears and pacing slightly closer. After a tense moment, the dog took the treat gently, his tail still stiff but wagging faintly. This small gesture was a breakthrough. James knew that he had begun to earn the dog's tentative trust, but he couldn't relax yet. Rex was still wary and protective, and the real test was yet to come. Meanwhile, the officer watched quietly, rubbing her wrists and shivering in the snow. She had seen Rex growl and pace, and she understood how deeply loyal he was. "Good boy," she whispered, reaching out slowly. Rex paused and turned to her, his growl fading slightly as he recognized her voice and scent. This moment of recognition allowed James to move a little closer. He had to be careful. Even a dog that knew him was still protective of its human. The officer's calm reassurance helped enormously, as it reminded Rex that they were both there to protect and care for him as well. James began slowly circling, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He spoke softly throughout, letting the sound of his voice become familiar to Rex. Every step was calculated, every gesture meant to communicate calm and safety. The snow around them was deep and difficult to navigate, but James focused entirely on the dog's reactions. When Rex twitched his ears or lowered his body slightly, James would pause, giving the dog time to adjust. This careful, patient approach was essential. In situations like this, rushing or forcing the dog's trust could lead to disaster. After several tense minutes, James finally felt that Rex was beginning to accept his presence. The growls became quieter, the body posture less rigid, and the dog allowed James to move a little closer to the officer. This slow, steady progress gave James the confidence to finally make physical contact with the officer without Rex becoming aggressive. He kept his hands visible, calm, and deliberate, showing no sudden movements. Rex sniffed his hands, tested him once, and then relaxed just enough to step back, allowing James to operate safely. This was a pivotal moment in the rescue mission. James realized that the dog's reaction had been a major challenge, but it had also provided him with an opportunity to prove himself as a trustworthy ally. The officer, seeing the dog's response, was visibly relieved, knowing that they could now move safely together. The bond between human and dog was clear and powerful, and James felt a deep respect for both of them. He knew that trust, once established, would allow them to move together through the harsh snow towards safety. Finally, James began to coordinate with the officer, keeping Rex calm while planning the next steps. He would need to lead them carefully back through the snowstorm, but he now had the full cooperation of the K9 partner, which was critical. Rex stayed alert but no longer aggressive, watching James closely as he prepared to guide them to safety. James understood that every decision from this point forward would rely on the trust he had carefully built in these tense minutes. The bond he had earned with the dog meant the difference between a smooth rescue and a dangerous confrontation in the freezing wilderness. As they prepared to move, James allowed a moment to appreciate the situation. The storm raged around them, the snow piled high, and the wind cut sharply across the clearing. But there was now a fragile calm in the center. The officer was free and Rex was loyal and protective, but also now aware that James was an ally, not a threat. This was the turning point, the moment that would determine how successfully they could navigate the perilous journey ahead. James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that his patience, calmness, and understanding had paid off. The rescue was far from over, but this critical challenge had been met with skill, courage, and respect for the bond between human and canine. After several tense minutes of careful observation, James Carter finally felt that Rex, the German Shepherd, was beginning to trust him. The dog's growls had faded to soft whines, and his stiff, tense posture had relaxed just enough to indicate that James was no longer a threat. The officer, still shivering and exhausted from the cold and restraints, watched with a mixture of relief and admiration. She had seen countless scenarios in her line of work, but nothing quite like the loyalty and intelligence of her K9 partner. And now she also saw the skill and patience of James. The bond between them was undeniable, and James knew that earning Rex's trust was the key to successfully rescuing both of them from the snow-covered wilderness. James reached slowly into his backpack and pulled out another treat for Rex. He didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, meant to show the dog that he was calm and controlled. He held the treat out and knelt slightly, lowering himself closer to the dog's level. Rex sniffed the treat, then sniffed James's hand, his tail giving a slight wag. James spoke in a soft, reassuring voice. "Good boy, easy now, it's okay." The dog relaxed even more, stepping slightly closer to James, but never leaving the officer's side. This cautious but steady progress gave James the confidence to move closer to the officer and begin preparing for the next part of their escape. The officer was still shivering, her teeth chattering from the cold. James quickly assessed her condition. Frostbite was not yet a major issue, but prolonged exposure could be dangerous if they did not find shelter soon. He carefully removed her jacket, checking for injuries and making sure her clothing could keep her warm once they started moving. James's movements were calm and precise, showing experience and control under pressure. The officer looked at him with grateful eyes, realizing that he had not only rescued her from the ropes, but had also tamed the tension between her loyal dog and a stranger. Rex, sensing the officer's condition and James's intentions, began to relax even more. He moved closer to her side, nuzzling her hand in reassurance, while keeping a watchful eye on James. James understood that Rex's cooperation was essential. The dog's instincts would alert them to danger, protect the officer if necessary, and help guide them safely back to civilization. At this point, James realized that the dog's behavior was not just a challenge. It was an incredible advantage. Rex was intelligent, loyal, and alert. With the dog's trust secured, James had a reliable partner to navigate the dangers ahead. Once Rex's trust was established, James turned his full attention to the officer. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, from being tied up and exposed to the snowstorm. He encouraged her to take slow, deep breaths, and then helped her to her feet. Every step was careful, as the snow was deep and the terrain uneven. James supported her physically, holding her arm to prevent falls, while Rex walked closely at her side. The teamwork between the three of them was immediate and instinctive. James led the way, the officer followed, and Rex stayed vigilant, alert to every sound and movement around them. As they began their journey through the snow, James continually scanned the surroundings. The storm was relentless, and visibility was low. Hidden dangers lurked in every direction. Deep snowdrifts, hidden rocks, and potential ice-covered crevasses. James had to think several steps ahead, planning the safest route while keeping both the officer and Rex moving steadily. He spoke in quiet, reassuring tones to both, maintaining a calm rhythm and steady pace. "Almost there. Keep moving. Stay close," he said softly, making sure the officer and dog could hear his instructions over the wind. The officer, despite her exhaustion, began to rely on James completely. She trusted his expertise and followed his lead, letting him guide her through the snow. Rex, now fully cooperative, stayed at her side, sniffing the air and scanning for potential threats. The dog's instincts were invaluable in this environment. Every crack of a branch or unusual sound made Rex alert, and his protective behavior gave James extra confidence that they would not be taken by surprise. The officer marveled at the coordination between James and Rex, realizing how vital the dog had been throughout her ordeal. As they moved through the blizzard, James remained focused and vigilant. He checked frequently to make sure the officer was managing the cold and fatigue, offering encouragement and support whenever needed. He also kept a close eye on Rex, occasionally speaking softly or offering treats to reinforce the dog's trust and cooperation. The small gestures paid off, as Rex stayed alert but calm, ready to respond to danger without panicking. After what felt like hours navigating the snow-covered terrain, James finally spotted a safer path leading toward a more open area. The snowstorm had not let up, but the terrain seemed slightly easier, with fewer obstacles and more solid footing. James encouraged the officer to keep moving steadily, while Rex stayed at her side, watching over them both. The trust between all three had solidified, allowing them to work together as a team. The officer felt a surge of hope, knowing that with James's guidance and Rex's protection, they could survive this treacherous journey. By the time they reached a slightly more open area, James allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. The hardest part, earning the dog's trust and preparing the officer to move, had been accomplished. The snowstorm was still fierce, and the journey was far from over, but they were united, alert, and ready to face whatever came next. With Rex now fully cooperative, James knew they had a real chance of making it back safely, turning a desperate rescue into a coordinated, life-saving operation. With the officer untied and Rex now fully cooperative, James Carter knew that the next challenge would be just as demanding as the rescue itself. Getting all three of them safely back to the extraction point through the unforgiving snowstorm. The blizzard showed no signs of slowing, and the freezing temperatures made every step a struggle. Snow had already built up over their boots, and the wind cut sharply through their layers, making the cold feel even more intense. But James remained focused, his years of Navy SEAL training guiding him every step of the way. He understood that moving quickly without caution could be fatal, and moving too slowly could allow hypothermia to take its toll on the officer. Balance, precision, and careful planning were key. James led the way, using his knowledge of survival and terrain to navigate through the treacherous mountains. The snow was deep and heavy, and hidden obstacles were everywhere. Patches of ice, hidden rocks, and snow-covered crevasses that could swallow a person in an instant. Every step had to be deliberate, testing the ground before placing full weight on it. He constantly scanned the area, listening for any unusual sounds. A snapping branch, shifting snow, or the faint crunch of footprints that didn't belong. The mountains were silent in many ways, but to someone trained like James, every tiny sound could be a clue to danger or safety. The officer struggled to keep up at first. Her muscles ached, and the exhaustion from being restrained for hours made every step painful. James offered steady support, guiding her carefully, occasionally placing his hand under her arm to help her maintain balance. Rex walked close at her side, nudging her gently and keeping a watchful eye on James and the surroundings. The dog's presence was reassuring, a silent reminder that they were not alone and that danger would be met head-on if necessary. The bond between the officer and her K9 became a lifeline during this journey, and James relied on both their strengths to navigate the storm. As they moved forward, James kept a steady rhythm, using short breaks to reassess their surroundings. The storm was relentless and visibility was low, but he had learned to read subtle changes in the snow and wind patterns. These observations helped him pick the safest path through the mountains. He knew that rushing through the storm could lead to disaster. Hidden cliffs or weak snow bridges could collapse under their weight. James's calm, methodical approach reassured both the officer and Rex that he knew what he was doing. Occasionally, Rex would pause and sniff the air, ears alert and body tense. James followed the dog's lead, recognizing that Rex's instincts were a valuable guide in this dangerous environment. The dog's reactions often indicated hidden threats or unstable terrain that James might not notice immediately. By paying attention to Rex, James could adjust their path in real time, avoiding hidden hazards and ensuring that the officer remained safe. The teamwork between man and dog was seamless, a testament to the intelligence and loyalty of the K9 and the experience of James. Despite their careful progress, the cold began to take its toll. The officer shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as frost threatened to set in on exposed skin. James stopped briefly, using a scarf from his pack to cover her face and hands, protecting them from frostbite. He encouraged her to breathe slowly, stay calm, and focus on one step at a time. "We're almost there," he said quietly, though he knew they were still far from safety. Each step through the deep snow was exhausting, but he reminded her that panic or rushing would make the journey even more dangerous. As they climbed a particularly steep section of the mountain, James noticed that the snow beneath them was soft in some areas and packed in others. He tested each step before committing his weight, ensuring that neither he nor the officer would sink into a hidden crevasse. Rex led the way cautiously, testing the snow with his paws and signaling potential dangers. The officer followed closely, trusting James and Rex completely. Their movements were synchronized, a slow but steady march through a landscape that was as beautiful as it was deadly. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The wind screamed around them, and snowflakes stung exposed skin. But James never faltered. He kept moving, constantly encouraging the officer and guiding Rex. The dog occasionally glanced up at him, as if acknowledging their progress and the trust that had been built. This silent communication was crucial. It allowed James to anticipate Rex's behavior and use the dog's instincts to their advantage. The officer, too, gained confidence with each step, knowing she was in capable hands. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spotted a faint outline in the distance. A clearing where the snow appeared slightly less treacherous, a possible route toward the extraction point. His heart lifted slightly, though he did not let himself relax completely. They still had to cross several hundred more meters of snow-covered terrain. Carefully, he led them forward, using all his training and experience to maintain safety. Each step brought them closer to survival, closer to warmth, and closer to safety. Rex's watchful eyes never left the surroundings, and the officer's trust in James never wavered. Together, the three of them moved steadily through the blizzard, a small but determined team against the overwhelming force of nature. Every crunch of snow underfoot, every gust of wind, and every careful movement brought them closer to the extraction point. Though exhausted and cold, they had survived the most dangerous part of the mission, the initial rescue, and were now on the final, grueling journey to safety, relying on teamwork, trust, and determination to see them through. After hours of painstaking progress through the blizzard, James Carter could finally see the faint outline of the extraction point in the distance. The helicopter that had been dispatched for the rescue was hovering low, its rotors kicking up swirling snow, making visibility even more challenging. The noise was deafening, yet it was a welcome sound, proof that their mission was nearing its end. James felt a surge of relief, though he didn't allow himself to relax completely. The snow-covered terrain was still treacherous, and one misstep could undo all their hard work. Every step had to remain deliberate, especially with the officer exhausted and Rex alert to any potential danger. James moved steadily, keeping the officer close at his side while Rex walked slightly ahead and beside her, alert but calm. The dog's protective instincts remained strong, but James's careful handling and the trust they had built allowed Rex to respond without aggression. The officer clutched Rex's leash tightly, leaning on James for support. She was shivering, exhausted from the freezing temperatures, and every movement required tremendous effort. But the sight of the helicopter in the distance renewed her strength and determination. She could see warmth, safety, and a return to civilization waiting just ahead. As they approached the clearing near the extraction point, James carefully scanned the surroundings for any hazards. The helicopter's blades kicked up thick clouds of snow, obscuring the view, and the gusts created sudden drifts and uneven patches of snow on the ground. James guided the officer carefully, instructing her to step slowly and watch each placement of her feet. "One step at a time," he said quietly but firmly. Rex followed every movement with precision, his ears twitching, body tense yet obedient. The dog had completed his duty so far, but James knew he had to remain vigilant until they were fully safe aboard the helicopter. The officer, despite exhaustion, took comfort in Rex's presence. She whispered soft words of encouragement to her loyal companion, praising him for staying strong throughout the ordeal. "You did amazing, Rex," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of relief and emotion. The dog responded with a soft bark and a gentle nudge, reassuring her that they were almost out of danger. James observed the interaction quietly, admiring the bond between the two. It was a bond forged in trust, loyalty, and shared struggle, and it had played a critical role in keeping them alive through the storm. As they neared the helicopter, James signaled to the pilot to maintain a steady hover. The downdraft from the rotor blades created powerful gusts that whipped through the clearing, making it difficult to keep balance on the snow-covered ground. He positioned himself between the officer and the edge of the clearing, guiding her carefully while also ensuring that Rex stayed calm. The dog's instincts remained sharp, but the trust James had earned allowed him to control the situation without causing panic or aggression. The pilot began lowering a safety rope for them to climb into the helicopter. James tested the ground first, ensuring it was stable enough for the officer to step onto safely. He helped her reach the rope, supporting her as she climbed slowly and carefully. Each movement was deliberate, as the snow and wind made footing precarious. Rex hesitated for a moment, sensing the motion and the danger of the hover, but the officer spoke gently to him, calming the dog and encouraging him to follow. With James at her side, Rex leapt lightly onto the rope platform, landing safely beside the officer. Finally, they were both aboard the helicopter. James followed quickly, ensuring Rex and the officer were secure before taking his own place. The helicopter rose into the air, spinning a whirlwind of snow behind it as it carried them away from the perilous mountains. The roar of the rotors and the whipping wind were intense, but inside the helicopter, the atmosphere was quieter, more controlled. The officer wrapped a blanket around herself, still shivering but beginning to feel the warmth returning to her body. Rex settled near her feet, attentive but calmer, finally able to relax slightly now that they were moving toward safety. As the helicopter gained altitude, James allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had navigated the blizzard, avoided hidden dangers, and kept the officer and Rex safe through extremely harsh conditions. His training, patience, and quick thinking had been tested to the limit, and yet the mission had been a success. The officer looked at him with gratitude, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and deep appreciation. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse but sincere. James simply nodded, acknowledging her thanks while remaining focused on their safe arrival at base. Rex, ever loyal, stayed close to the officer, occasionally glancing at James as if recognizing him as part of their rescue team. The dog's instincts remained sharp, but the tension of the rescue had eased slightly. James knew that the bond between the officer and her canine was unbreakable, and he felt a quiet respect for the courage and loyalty they had shown throughout the ordeal. The helicopter ride allowed them all to recover slightly, the warmth and motion contrasting sharply with the freezing conditions they had endured outside. By the time the helicopter touched down at the extraction point, the storm still raged in the mountains behind them, but they were safe. Rescue personnel were waiting, prepared to provide immediate care. The officer stepped out carefully, guided by James, while Rex remained by her side, alert and protective even in safety. James watched the reunion with a sense of quiet pride. They had survived a life-threatening ordeal together, relying on trust, teamwork, and courage to overcome impossible odds. For James, it was another reminder of why he had trained so hard. To be ready for moments like this, where lives depended on skill, patience, and unwavering focus. After the helicopter safely touched down at the base, a sense of relief washed over everyone. The stormy mountains behind them still raged with snow and wind, but for James Carter, the officer, and Rex, the ordeal was finally over. Stepping off the helicopter, the officer wrapped herself tightly in a warm blanket, shivering less as the warmth of the base began to restore her body temperature. She glanced down at Rex, who remained close at her side, his eyes bright and attentive despite the exhaustion from hours of guarding and navigating through the snow. The bond between them was undeniable, forged through shared struggle and mutual loyalty. James watched quietly, knowing that he had played a role in keeping both of them alive, but the true hero of the story in many ways was Rex. Medical personnel quickly checked the officer for signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and injury. Her wrists were sore from being tied, and her body was fatigued from fighting the freezing elements, but she was otherwise physically unharmed. James assisted where needed, ensuring that Rex stayed calm and close to her while the medical team worked efficiently. The dog remained alert, his protective instincts still active, yet he seemed to recognize that the immediate danger had passed. The officer gently stroked his head, whispering words of comfort and praise. "You saved me, Rex. I don't know what I would have done without you," she said softly. The dog nudged her hand in response, offering the kind of loyalty and reassurance only a true companion could provide. James allowed himself a brief moment to take in the scene. The stormy wilderness that had threatened their lives now seemed distant, almost unreal compared to the warmth and activity of the base. He reflected on the rescue, the careful tracking through snow, the tense moment of gaining Rex's trust, and the painstaking journey back through treacherous terrain. Every decision, every step, every small act of patience had mattered. The officer had survived because of the teamwork between him, the dog, and the officer herself. It was a reminder that survival often depended on trust, patience, and understanding in high-pressure situations. The officer, now seated and wrapped in blankets, looked at James with gratitude that needed no words. Her eyes reflected relief, respect, and a quiet admiration. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice still hoarse from the cold and tension. James nodded, offering a simple, modest acknowledgement. For him, the reward was seeing them safe and knowing the mission had been successful. But he also felt a deep respect for the courage of the officer, who had endured hours of extreme conditions, and for Rex, whose loyalty and instincts had been vital in every step of the rescue. Rex, sensing the officer's safety, finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He lay down near her feet, still alert but no longer tense. James watched the dog carefully, noting the subtle signs of relief. The tail wagging faintly, ears shifting back in relaxation, and the soft, calm gaze toward the officer. Rex had fulfilled his role perfectly, protecting his human when she needed it most and trusting James to guide them both through danger. This moment highlighted the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, especially when survival is at stake. James had earned the dog's respect, but it was the dog's loyalty that had been most remarkable throughout the ordeal. The officer began recounting the events of her ordeal to the base personnel, her words conveying both fear and admiration. She spoke of the struggle, the freezing cold, and the moment she thought she might not make it through the storm. Yet she also described Rex's unwavering presence, his intelligence in sensing danger, and the comfort he had provided during hours of isolation and uncertainty. She paused to glance at James, acknowledging his critical role. Without his skill, patience, and quick thinking, their escape from the mountains would not have been possible. The story spread quietly among the team, emphasizing the power of trust, teamwork, and courage in life-threatening situations. James remained humble, watching the officer and Rex interact. The dog rested his head on the officer's lap, eyes half closed, finally allowing himself a moment of peace. The officer smiled, her hand brushing through his fur. It was clear that they shared a bond that had deepened through the ordeal. James felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his training and experience had made a real difference, but he also recognized that the true courage had been displayed by both the officer and Rex. Survival in extreme conditions required skill, patience, and trust, qualities each of them had demonstrated in abundance. As the hours passed, the officer was warmed and fed, and Rex received water and attention. James observed quietly, knowing that their ordeal was over but that the emotional impact would remain. The storm had tested their limits, but it had also revealed the strength of the human-animal bond and the resilience of those willing to fight for life. The officer's gratitude and Rex's unwavering loyalty were reminders that courage and trust could overcome even the harshest conditions. In the quiet of the base, with the snowstorm raging outside, James finally allowed himself a deep breath. The mission was complete. The officer was safe, Rex had performed flawlessly, and together they had navigated impossible conditions. It was a story of survival, trust, and heroism. One that would be remembered not only for the danger they faced, but also for the extraordinary bond between a human and their K9 companion. The dog, once a fierce protector in the snow, had now become a symbol of loyalty and courage. The officer's relief, Rex's calm vigilance, and James's quiet pride marked the end of an ordeal, and the beginning of a story that would inspire everyone who heard it.